director of Trias, but she came back from AWT with a mild cough and has been banned from the reading for that reason. So my name is Catherine Coles. I am the occasional Trias director, and I will be reading an introduction from Lydia Yuknovich, who is our Trias writer-in-residence last semester, who also cannot make it because she got a little bit ill while out on a book tour. So this stuff is already hitting us. We were just talking about whether or not I should even announce the other readings that we have scheduled for the rest of the semester. We have a terrific lineup that may or may not happen, including there's a reading that's on the books from David Weiss, his book launch for his book Per Diem that's supposed to happen with the writer Steve Casisto also. We really hope that will happen. We've got, let's see, Robert Glick and Shana McAuliffe probably readings, maybe, probably not, I don't know, sometime in April. I have my book release reading that probably won't happen, also sometime in April, and then Taylor Brorby's reading at the very end of the semester is the least likely of all of them to happen. But maybe it will. Keep your eye out for, we can all keep our fingers crossed, and in the meantime, wash the fingers that are crossed and all the other ones too, frequently and with great vigor. Okay, so Lydia wrote this introduction. What were the other things I was supposed to say? Thank Peter Trias. Peter Trias, our patron saint of Trias. Not very often do poets get a degree in poetry from the Iowa Writers Workshop and then go on to be real estate moguls in Malibu and then give a bunch of money to their alma mater, but ours did that. And you are all the beneficiaries of this. Really, really lucky to be able to take classes from these nationally renowned, internationally renowned writers that we bring to campus. And you should, if you are not a senior this year, then you should consider trying to write your way into one of those classes, which are open to everybody. Anybody can try to write their way into those classes. You don't have to be an English major. You don't have to have taken a prerequisite. You just have to turn in some writing and make your way in. So consider doing that when we announce future residents coming. And thank you to Peter Trias. Okay. So this is an introduction written by Lydia. I wore my tall boots because I feel like she would need me to be wearing tall boots in order to channel her. But I'm much shorter than her and far less kind of compelling in person. But I will do my best. Lance Olsen is a heterodox hero. In fact, I'm fairly sure he coined the term heterodox as well as the terms narraticules and narrative opportunity space and architectonics. And now that I'm on the subject, I'll just say that Lance Olsen has done more for innovative writing than any other writer on the planet. I know this firsthand since I have known and worked with Lance and Andy since my first fledgling book attempts. Put simply, if I had never met them, I would not be a writer. Lance's books have galactically inspired me over the last 30 years, but I would also like to say out loud that Lance has been a ride or die figure for me in my own artistic practice and life. His work has deeply informed my thinking, my writing, my artistic process, and he's outpaced 3 of my husbands in terms of longevity of friendship. On the page, Lance is breathtaking, always, every single time. How many writers can you say that about these days? The reason his work continues to take your breath away is that he approaches each new work as an event horizon. Of his most recent book, The Dazzling My Red Heaven, and side note for me, this is a terrific book that is being sold in the back of the room, and you should really, really, really consider picking up a copy of it. Back to the Lydia persona. Of his most recent book, The Dazzling My Red Heaven, in an interview with the Brooklyn Rail, Lance said that the book is a love letter to modernism and went on to say this, and this is a large quote from Lance. I have always found kin in those who are out of step with their times, aesthetic and temporal refugees, often geographical too, and in many ways not being at home is the definition of the avant-garde. When critics and novelists consciously engage with earlier work, as I often do in my writing, thinking with it, against it, and through it, what they produce is a mode of saying thank you to that work, as well, naturally, as a way of killing their parents. I would never have become a writer, the writer I am, without all the complexities, conflictions, and complications we call modernism. For that last, I don't know how many years, I've taught an undergraduate course about it. Eduardo Galeano has a much better way of phrasing what I'm trying to say than I do. Quote, history never really says goodbye. History says, see you later. Our past, whether individual or cultural, never stays, even as it never goes away. And that's the end of the big quotation. I'd like to swim inside that quote for a very long time. Since I believe literature is a living organism, I feel lucky to be a writer during the time of Lance Olsen. His work is both daringly intellectual, always taking on history and literary theory, Derrida and Lyotard and Wittgenstein and Arendt, as well as questions around epistemology and ontology. At the same time, I can always feel my own beating hearts inside his texts, my own heart beating inside his texts. He suspends narrative time and space to capture and shiver the moment before, or a moment we usually miss. He takes as his topic history itself, the last piece of Friedrich Nietzsche, or the moment before a film starts in a polyphonic novel, or in the case of My Red Heaven, the moment before catastrophe in Germany, the moment when everyone was walking around just being a person, and danger, as Benjamin noted, flashes up. If I was there, I would tell you how Lance and I read together so many years ago at City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, and how meaningful that trip was for me in my memory. I would also tell you, excuse me, asthma cough, I swear it's not coronavirus. And how meaningful that trip was for me in my memory. I would also tell you that it remains the most meaningful reading I've ever had in my present tense. Or I'd tell you about the silliest reading experience we had together. Just ask him later about 3 words, Park City, Utah. Lance and Andy Olsen are my lifelong art and heart comrades, and so I can say even during times of pestilence and doom, I feel lucky to be alive during a time when I can make art alongside them both. Everything I have written is in part a love letter to them both. From Lydia Yuknovich. And then this is a kind of addendum. Lance Olsen is the author of more than 25 books of and about innovative writing, including most recently the novels Dream Lives of Debris and My Red Heaven. His short stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in hundreds of journals and anthologies such as Conjunctions, Blackberry Review, Fiction International, Village Voice, Baum, McSweeney's, and Best American Non-Required Reading, a Guggenheim Berlin Prize DAAD Artist in Berlin Residence, Pushcart Prize and 2-time NEA Fellowship recipient, as well as a Fulbright Scholar. He teaches experimental narrative theory and practice at the University of Utah. Lance Olsen.
Holy cow. So will Lydia see that? Lydia! We're literary soulmates. That is so awesome. I am like amazingly, and perfect channeling. That's so great. Thanks everybody so much for coming out tonight, and thank you Catherine and David and Ben and Taylor for taking such good care of us while we're here, and all those in the English department for making this happen. It's a real pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do over the course of the next 30 minutes or so is to introduce you to my new novel, My Red Heaven. The cover looks like that. I am so proud of the cover. I had nothing to do with it, that's why I can say that, but it's designed after posters in 1930s Germany. And it's set in 1927, Berlin. In other words, between the two wars, right? The First World War ended in 1918, the Second World War began in 1939. And then I'm going to read a little bit after I introduce you to it, and then just open things up to conversation, whatever you guys want to talk about, ask about, comment on, that would be great. So the story of My Red Heaven begins here with Otto Freundlich, who's a painter, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. We see him in the photograph to the left, and then in a lithograph by the German painter and printmaker Otto Dix of him to the right. Okay, he was born, Freundlich, to a Jewish family in Stolp in northwest Germany in 1878. And after studying dentistry for a little while, he saw the light and decided to become an artist. Moved to Paris in 1908 and lived in Montmartre, just down the street from people like Picasso and people like Braque. And he was one of the first generation of what are called abstract cubists, and I'll show you a little bit of his work in just a minute. Anyway, so following the disasters of World War I, he also became increasingly politically active, increasingly a sort of anti-war, anti-rising Nazi activist, and left Germany to live completely in France. Back in Germany, however, his work was condemned by the Nazis who were coming to power at the time, and some of his pieces were seized and destroyed. Others were displayed in the 1937 Nazi exhibition called Untitled Kunst, which is the degenerate art exhibition in Munich. I don't know if you've heard about that or not. That was a exhibition put on by the Nazis to essentially deride, discredit modernist art, the modernist project in general. And these pieces that were seized included this monumental sculpture of his called Der Neue Mensch, the new human, which was used as the cover illustration for the Nazi catalog. As you can see, and Der Neue Mensch was never recovered after World War II, so the assumption is that it was destroyed. Anyway, in 1943, the Nazis came for him, arrested him, and deported him to the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland, where he was murdered within minutes of his arrival. He's best known for his plans that never came to fruition of building a road that connected Berlin and Moscow. And the idea was he wanted to bring in all these artists and line the road with sculptures. And it was going to be sort of his vision of what could happen in the world. It's so beautiful, but that never manifested. I took the title of my novel from this work, though, which is an abstract cubist painting called Mein Roter Himmel, My Red Heaven. And as you can see, it's non-representational, and it's composed of all sorts of colorful shapes, right? But in Freundlich's mind moved from the black, which is a kind of hellish color, through the colors of earth up to the colors of heaven. And it was connotative to me from the very first time I saw it of this incredible energy that existed in Berlin in those interwar years. Everything was happening there. All the interesting artists, the musicians, the writers, the scientists were sort of thriving in this culture that existed in Berlin. It's also something that gestures toward a collage aesthetic, as you can see. In its collection of apparently disparate structures, right, on one surface that simultaneously unifies those shapes and underscores their multiplicity. So, for me, every form suggests a philosophy. That form isn't just a toolkit that we use when we create things, but rather that form itself works to establish a kind of meaning in a work. And for me, collage, which works through juxtaposition of the incommensurate, things that don't go together get put on the same surface, refuses to privilege one vision over another vision. I think that's what attracts me to the idea of collage at a deep structure level. So if you think about modernism, you think about collage actually as the dominant form of modernism. And you can see, a lot of you are probably familiar with Picasso's work and Braque's work in collage. Also, the voices that comprise Joyce's Ulysses, right, that are completely incommensurate. Bloom and Molly and Stephen Dedalus, or the voices that comprise of Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, or Eliot's Wasteland, right? The original title of Eliot's Wasteland was He'd Do the Police in Different Voices, right? So collage argues that every voice, each vision, is always available, tenable, and arbitrary. And it argues for polyphony, not just formally, but as a mode of being, right? You can't find the dominant voice in Joyce or Faulkner or Eliot. So I became interested in, as soon as I saw Freundlich's painting, what would happen if you translated that into narrative? What would it look like, right? And a lot of my work comes to me primarily as a form that then takes shape around something. So each chapter in My Red Heaven takes the shape of a little narrative. It's 7 pages or so long, as short as 3, a little bit longer than 7, in length, exploring the consciousness of a historical figure who's either living in Berlin or passing through Berlin on this one day in 1927, June 10th, which is kind of a nod both to Virginia Woolf and to James Joyce in certain ways. Anyway, and there's Ludwig Wittgenstein in there, there's Werner Heisenberg, there's Einstein, there's Nabokov, who's passing through, he was a refugee, Mies van der Rohe, Arnold Schoenberg, Rosa Luxemburg, and then other people who history's forgotten, right? There's a sommelier, there's a pickpocket, there are a couple of ghosts because all novels should have some of those. And the idea then is to create this broad narrative canvas called Berlin, and in many ways Berlin is the sort of disoriented and disorienting protagonist of the novel, and protagonist as collage, right? Berlin's a collage city that investigates the resonant complexity of the rise of a deadly right-wing populism, that should sound familiar, at the heart of a thriving center for artists, writers, and intellectuals at a time when all fences seem down and the future utterly unimaginable. This idea, in 1927 that 1933 could have happened. Hitler was just a joke on the political stage in 1927. Was just unfathomable. So here you're looking at a headline to an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. I just dug up a couple weeks ago, actually. But it appeared February 2nd, 1933. And it really resonated. 3 days after Hitler was appointed chancellor through completely democratic means in Germany. And the article reassures its readership that Hitler is no longer a threat because now he's part of the government and part of an institution surrounded by level minds that will keep him and his extreme positions in check. So, My Red Heaven invites us to think about the parallels, right, between that deadly right-wing populism and the various iterations that have taken hold again recently in Europe and in the United States through the proliferation of a narrative that alleges ordinary people's concerns have been disregarded by the so-called cultural and political elite. Such a narrative we see around us daily manifests as an increasingly manic nationalism, right? A renewed anti-Semitism and other modes of scapegoating minorities and intellectuals. We can talk about this a little bit afterwards, but in Germany, anti-Semitism's hugely on the rise. It's increased by 300% in the last year. A politics of fear and paranoia, right? A fostering of political and existential cynicism, because you can make people cynical enough, right? If you can make them believe that there's nothing worth believing in, you got them, right? Because there's nothing worth believing in. A gradual erosion of democratic institutions and values, a concomitant narrative advocating the position that a strongman leader is all we need to fix everything. And a manipulation and undermining of the media, fact, science, logic, educational institutions that teach critical thinking, so that in the end, people are coaxed into believing nothing can be trusted and therefore anything can be trusted, from crystals and ancient astronauts and the link between vaccines and autism, and a multitude of other conspiracy theories to climate change denial. And that was a picture of Charlottesville, where the neo-Nazis were marching, and somebody was killed not too long ago, right? So in many ways, the goal of my novels form slant rhymes with the situationist notion of détournement, to turn pop and populist forms against themselves, with an intent both to draw attention to their insidious assumptions and to disrupt them, however momentarily. So for me, My Red Heaven is therefore, as Lydia was saying, a kind of, oh no, she was quoting me as saying, so that's okay, a kind of love song to the modernist moment, right? Modernism is this amazing, amazing moment in European and American culture, especially where there was an intense avant-garde experimentation where everything could be thought and attempted and challenged and undone and redone. So in order to give you a little taste of My Red Heaven, I'm going to read just two brief passages. One's about 12 minutes, one's about 8 minutes. But I'm going to, in the background, loop a series of photos taken by a photographer who's named Michael Kreutsch, who's an expat who lived in Berlin, my partner Andy, and myself. And these photos are interlaced through the last movement of the text. And they're of what are called lost places that are around Berlin, usually abandoned spaces in whose walls the contemporary and the past are fused and confused. Now, I'll use them not to illustrate the text. I'm not interested in images that illustrate text, but interested in images that create sort of indirect and interesting harmonies and tensions and dissonances within the text. So here, by way of illustration, you're looking at the entrance to a hospital bunker that was sealed shut on the last day of the war, called the Battle of Berlin, the part of the war that was fighting in the streets of Berlin. And a lot of these places are like this. This is a bunker that was, you can still see the blood on the stretcher in the entrance. It was built to treat German soldiers in the last days of the war, and then locked up and left untouched. So first we're going to hear a chapter about a Doberman named Dahlia, and about our owners, Elisa and Otto Hampel, who became icons of resistance. These are real characters against the Nazi regime in Berlin. We haven't heard of them in the US, but in Berlin, they're real heroes. And then we'll hear a snippet from a chapter about Käthe Kollwitz, a Berlin artist whom some of you may have heard of, who worked in painting and etching, lithography, woodcuts, and sculpture. And she lost her youngest son, Peter, during the First World War. So let me go ahead and close that. And open up this. So the Doberman's name is Dahlia. Dahlia won't see the end of this day. She doesn't know that. What she knows is she's on the longest, most glorious walk of her life. There is no time but this time, no place but this place. She can scarcely endure all the smells and sounds and touches and tastes inside her. She is with her masters, and they have given her these radiant gifts, and it is impossible to conceive of a way to thank them enough. She doesn't understand the name of the woman behind her is Elisa Lemme. She doesn't understand the man's name is Otto Hampel. Otto and Elisa woke Dahlia improbably early this morning, asking her if she wanted to go out. Dahlia always wants to go out. That is her only knowledge. The flat she lives in is too small. The air in it too used up. Presence nowhere except on the other side of the front door. The whole of Dahlia's day, the whole of Dahlia's life, is an almost unendurable waiting for two questions. Do you want to go out, girl? Is that what you want? She bounds from her dream in which she is bounding for birds on the grassy shores of the Schlachtensee, and barking rapturously bounds from her master's bed toward her bowl beside the stove. She wolfs down her food, feels the choker collar going on, the leash clicking into place. Somewhere behind her, she senses her tail nub, over which she is continuously bewildered. She possesses no will, furiously aspiring to wag. And now she is here. And now she is here. And now she is here. Dahlia has no room for any other idea in her head. Elisa is making several short loudnesses in the direction of Otto. Dahlia can't grasp what they mean. Dahlia doesn't care. All she cares about is this flawless motion she is inhabiting. All she cares about is the prosperity of aromas and music through which she advances. How can one being celebrate them all? Morning soil, clang gods, urine echoes, flower breaths, the indescribably compelling shits of other dogs. Some shoe polishers no taller than Dahlia's hocks, some small bear huge and hairy, some agile, some nervous, some crippled, some cocky, some bereft, some almost as elated as Dahlia herself. Dahlia savors the elementary pleasure knowing she could kill them all. Eliza says to Otto, smoke bulging from her mouth up into the acute morning nip, I feel like an idiot. It's not going to rain today, Otto says. He considers the enlivening sky through the branches, adds, it should rain on a day like this. Maybe we should give it more thought, Eliza says. Eliza is 23, barely finished grammar school before dropping away from ruler smacks to become a domestic servant, and now her hands look 45, puffy, reddish, big-knuckled. Otto is 27, large-eared, thin-lipped, meager-chinned. He fell into factory work after the war and cherishes Eliza's hands because they tell him the same story every time he looks at them. I know what it feels like. I know how to pilot this place. Maybe we haven't done the math right, Eliza says. But she already knows there's no more math left to do. The numbers are the numbers. If there were more numbers to do, they would do them. Otto opens his mouth to respond. Eliza's frown stills him. Wordless, they finish the cigarette they're splitting. Otto kneels, calls over Dahlia, clicks off her leash. The Doberman wavers, looking up at him for guidance. Otto pulls a fist-sized dirty white ball from the pocket of his double-breasted coat and rises and chucks the ball far down the path between the lindens. Dahlia blasts after it, passing a funny-eyed old woman with long gray hair who drags her large leather purse on the ground behind her. Otto lights another cigarette, sucks the smoke deep into the abundant branches of his lungs, passes it to Eliza, trying to let the sear in his chest overrun him. Near the end of the path, Dahlia scoops up the ball, breaks 2 meters farther on, spins, and imagining the skull of a small animal between her jaws, a squirrel, a baby, blasts back toward them, an ecstatic black visual slur. Sentence fragments orbit Otto's head. He decides not to speak any of them. Instead, he kneels again, calls Dahlia over, clicks her leash back on. Eliza bends and fluffles the dog's neck and face and ears, and now Dahlia is here. And now she is here. And now she is here. And now, slobbery, dirty white ball in her mouth, she is trotting someplace else. She can't wait to discover where. She pushes forward into sunlight, proud, whirring with joy, oblivious that at the end of this walk she will meet a long line of puzzled fellow dogs. Dahlia will wait alertly with them, fragrances and loudnesses boisterous around her. Confident her masters have the situation in hand. And at the end of that line, a sour-smelling man in a white lab coat will unceremoniously yank her choker tight, as if she's just misbehaved, and shove her into an airtight metal box with 3 other baffle-jipping dogs, whom Dahlia has never met, slam down the door, and flip on the gas valve. For just under a minute, Dahlia will remember bounding at those birds in her dream, feeling as if she is at the gray edge of waking again. And then she will be over. By the time the sour-smelling man in the white lab coat opens the door, Otto and Eliza will be gone, already several blocks closer to their flat in gritty vetting, wordless, just 2 other dog owners among thousands who couldn't pay the raised canine tax in Berlin. They will miss Dahlia desperately for months, alternating between unconditional numbness and so much anxiety they will feel everything will go on fire in 10 seconds. They will relive that last betrayal, that line of rattled dogs, that metal box, that look in Dahlia's eyes as the vet bent toward her. Sometimes together, sometimes alone, and then less and less. Because they will learn that's how damage diminishes itself in the human body. 8 years, and they will wake up married. 5 more, and Eliza will open her front door to be handed a telegram informing her brother has been killed in action somewhere in France, fighting for something she can no longer fathom. In the 30 seconds it will take her to read and reread that telegram, everything will become whiteness. Perhaps as a means to honor her brother, all the feelings Eliza and Otto almost forgot they were once capable of experiencing, the couple will begin writing hundreds of postcards in clumsy script and bad grammar that urge their recipients to refrain from donating money to their government, refuse military service, resist the thing their country has become. Eliza and Otto will leave those postcards in apartment block stairwells and on park benches, in mailboxes and beneath neighbors' doors. Almost every one of them will be picked up by strangers and handed over to the Gestapo. The sheer number will lead the Gestapo to conclude they are dealing with a large, well-orchestrated, wide-ranging conspiracy. It will take nearly 18 months for them to realize they are wrong. 17 years after he throws Dahlia's dirty white ball down that path for the last time, a weighted and angled guillotine blade in a backyard workshed at Plötzensee prison will drop through Otto's neck. The blade will be reset, and 3 minutes later, drop through Eliza's. Both Hampels will be strapped onto their backs so they can see their futures flying toward them. What will be unusual about their executions is that nothing will be unusual about their executions. Otto's and Eliza's punishments will constitute 2 among the nearly 3,000 carried out in that workshed. Like all relatives of the beheaded and hanged in Plötzensee, theirs will be obliged to pay a fee of 1 Reichmark 50 for every day their family members spent in their cells, 300 for the execution itself, and 12 pfennigs to cover postage for the invoice of expenses. Like all bodies of those executed at Plötzensee, Otto's and Eliza's will be released to Herr Professor Dr. Hermann Stieve, physician at the University of Berlin, who with his students will dissect them for research purposes. The results over the years will generate 230 important academic papers, including one providing irrefutable evidence the rhythm method is not effective in preventing pregnancy. Now, though, none of that is happening. It is just Otto and Eliza strolling along a sandy path between 2 rows of trees on a bluing day. Just Dahlia trotting proudly in front of them, leading the way toward that envelope containing the invoice of expenses. A black shadow scrambles across their feet and flickers out. Eliza thinks, cloud. She reflexively raises her head to spot in the apartment block across the street 2 white faces hovering in 2 otherwise black windows, one directly above the other, peering down at her without expression. And now that I've lifted everybody's spirits up, I'm going to read a really dark one. So this is about Käthe Kollwitz, that painter that I was telling you about. And this is a short one. This is only about 6 or 8 minutes long. And it's called Mother, Child, Art Doesn't Help. You raise your head from your tiny work desk in your nearly empty studio and spot a taxi 2 floors below, rumbling over the cobblestones in Weissenburger Strasse. The profile of a passenger balloons up succinctly, jowly, fleshy nose, protruding lower lip, perhaps smoking a cigar stub, perhaps picking at his thumbnail. And the taxi enters a flickering perplexity of sun and shaggy branches, and the passenger elapses, and then the cinnabar and black car itself. There is the sharp amazement of it, the sense you might have passed that man on the street yesterday, pass him on the street tomorrow, and would never know it, never have an inkling about what he does or why. And that notion dissolving into the sun and shade dazzle quickly as the taxi itself, you lower your head and return to the limestone slab before you. This afternoon, you are making a lithograph of a mother and child. In the far corner, one of Beethoven's piano sonatas plays on your gramophone, birthday present from Carl. Your subject, late 20s, hair pulled back into an already graying bun, purple veins cobwebbing her cheeks and forehead, stepped out of the main gates of the brewery 2 blocks over. It was the end of the day shift. You often stroll by about that time, searching for all the ways grace can reveal itself. Most of the men and many of the women in your tenement, and many of the tenements that make up Prince Lauerberg, work in that brick building the color of stone-ground mustard. Midsummer, when the breezes stop, the factory's hot, yeasty fumes accumulate in the streets, cling to everything, bedding, towels, clothes, furniture, hair. You often recognize your neighbors among those coming through the gates, people you nod to every day in the stairwell that smells like the inside of a cardboard box, queue with for the toilet on the dark landing, the locals with whom you chat in the waiting room of Carl's medical practice around the corner. This woman's face caught you because of the stubbornness and tenderness and fatigue in it. You approached her, asked if she might be interested in posing, just 15 or 20 minutes, you promised, just a few drawings. Rather than slowing down over her shoulder, she asked, "How much?" Last Sunday afternoon, you met her in the small park across the street. You didn't expect her to turn up with her 3-year-old son, chubby-cheeked, mussed-hair, wearing miniature overalls. You told her your name was Ketta. She told you hers was Helga. Helga took a seat, her boy leaning into her. You carried most of the conversation, squatting before her, trying to get her to relax. Her boy loosened into sleep while Helga replied in monosyllables. She seemed both defiant and suspicious of you and your peculiar undertaking. Why would someone fritter away her time like this when there was so much honest work to be done? You made several hasty sketches in your pad and thanked her. The second your money touched her palm, you could make out some part of her click off and began gaining distance from you, even before her body moved. Draping her groggy son over her shoulder like a lazy cat, she turned and left without saying goodbye. Somehow, you always find yourself making lithographs of mothers and children. You keep circling around the theme, returning to it as though someday you could get it right if you just kept at it long enough. Over the years, you have learned you work the way a cow grazes, rush, and all you do is make your mistakes faster. The stickiness of your grease crayon, tang of your black ink, smooth movements of your hand. That's it. That's all. That has to be enough. Once, you had the audacity to believe you were some kind of revolutionary. In your childhood dreams, you died a hero on barricades. Perhaps you believed too long that humans were heading somewhere. But when your son, when Peter, when only 3 months after the war hit, that's when old age commenced flourishing inside you, the news from Flanders crashing in. You were 47. You finally recognized all armies were simply postponing the end of the world from one day to the next. Every war carried within itself the war that would become its answer. Karl Kollwitz was a teenage medical student when you met him. He wore his Van Dyke and silver pince nez with elegance, was a committed socialist, a member in good standing with the SPD. You were Kata Schmitz, a person you have come to consider a sister, from whom you have slowly drifted apart over the decades. It proved easy to admire Karl, and next adore him. He proposed and you said yes, and he asked what he could give you, how he could help your art. You started to love him when you moved to Prince Lauerberg and he decided to dedicate his practice to the needy. You did too in a way, documenting those who lived around you. Karl built a studio for you, the one you were sitting in. He hired Sonia, your live-in housekeeper. You loved him even more when you found yourself pregnant with Hans and 4 years later Peter, and instead of your production slowing down as you eased out of your 20s with 2 boys and a husband in tow, it sped up. But when Peter, when it storms back at you, you feel all your strength scraped out. It was the news from Flanders. It was the hours. It was... You can make another lithograph of a mother and child, 1,000 of them, yet you will never get any closer to your dead son, your progressively distant husband, those absurd barricades, your youth. Art doesn't help. That's the hardest lesson you've had to learn. People say it does. People insist art makes things better. You prove them wrong every day. Art doesn't make life more bearable or longer or impervious to anguish. Its real goal is the opposite, to teach you nobody can be saved in the end. And on that incredibly upbeat note, I apologize for, humanity. Let's go ahead and open things up to conversation. If anybody has any questions or comments or anything you want to talk about with respect to history, art, modernism, life, death. Yeah.
So somewhere in the book there is a parenthesis, and the sentence inside the parentheses is every force evolves a form, which I always took to be from Guy Davenport, but may well have, he might have gotten it from somewhere else. But the quote that was on the screen, every form, I'm forgetting the verb now. Suggests a philosophy. But you put that quote in. Was it from Guy Davenport for one thing, or does it come from an earlier source?
It comes from an earlier source, but Guy Davenport was a colleague of mine in my first job, actually, at the University of Kentucky. And, that should go away. Just a second. There we go. Guy, what was so if you haven't read any Guy Davenport, there's a collection of short stories called Da Vinci's Bicycle, and it's just so glorious. Guy was sort of, in many ways, the last modernist, right? And he was friends with Hugh Kenner, who was one of the major critics of modernism, wrote a book called The Pound Arrow. Anyway, so Guy used that line as if it were his own, but it actually comes from Mies van der Rohe. And my thing just, I think, happens to kind of slam rhyme with it, right? Every form suggests a philosophy. But it's true. So, a lot of us locate meaning when we're reading in character, when we're reading fiction, in character or in plot, that sort of thing, which is totally true. But what really interests me is how form carries that meaning as well, right? How the form you choose when you're writing, and you do choose, right? It's all a matter of choices, will suggest a philosophy. And, one of the things I'm really interested in are forms that break conventional notions of narrativity, right? We inherit narratives, and we hear them so many times that we begin to take them as truths, when in fact all they are repeated narratives. And And what I'm really interested in is dislocating those narrative forms. So Goebbels, who was Hitler's media guy, has a famous quote about if you tell a lie and make the lie big enough and repeat it often enough, people will always believe it. And it worked for 80 million Germans and a lot of other people. And it works for us today, right, in political situations. And what's really interesting is trying to find forms that don't take anything for granted. Collage is one of those. Collage is so awesome as a form because you can't have one vision when you work in collage. You have to be listening to other visions and trying to suggest that all visions are worthwhile listening to. Yeah, that was really a long-winded answer. That's okay.
Good one.
Sorry, things are here. Yeah, Catherine.
I hate to have faculty jump right on it, but you know what you just said made me think about how you changed the stories slightly in your reading of them, and I wonder if that is just to edit it down to time, or if the form of reading out loud is the page.
Both, yeah. It's partially for reading out loud, but partially, I'm also doing something very weird. Like the thing that I read about Katakolvis was actually an earlier draft than the thing that turned into the final draft in the novel. And I just have fun, like, listening to all the various things. But also, I love the sound of sentences, and you read sentences differently when you're reading them aloud versus when you're reading them to yourself. And so I'm always trying to position sentences so that the sound when you're reading out loud is something to just delight into. Because the form of a sentence, right, is just what I just said on a microcosmic scale. And I think a lot of us agree to this, but if we don't, that's okay too. But fiction writing does two things that other genres don't do. Okay, now I'm going to make a generality that there are probably 5,000 exceptions to, but I'll deny all of them. But one of them is consciousness, right? So fiction can inhabit somebody's consciousness for an extended period of time, right? The long poem can do it, but not for 700 pages usually, right? And the idea of reading fiction and utterly inhabiting another human consciousness for 3 days, 5 days, 7 days is kind of miraculous, right? And to write in somebody else's consciousness so that you can try to gain some kind of empathy with another human being at the deepest level is magnificent. That fiction does. Film doesn't do that, right? Film's going to be 100 minutes, 110 minutes, and it's always inferred consciousness. The only way you get internal consciousness is to do, sort of dubs, and those always seem really weird in film. So every genre does. And then the other thing is language. For extended periods of time, poetry does language gorgeously, but usually in a more concentrated form. But think of, the 780 pages of Ulysses, which is, if you haven't read it, you should read it tonight. It's a really good book. It's real patient. But every sentence is so gorgeous, right? That's what fiction can do for extended periods of time, right? Truman Capote once said of Kerouac stuff that isn't writing, that's typing. And like, we don't want to do just typing. We want to do something else. We want to make little songs. So, yeah. Oh, good. Yes, thank you.
So you talked a lot about form and sound and language, which are all things that, like, as a poet, I tend to associate with poetry. So I was just curious about what you, to what extent do you regard your work as having, apoetics, or what is the relationship of poetry to your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So 15, 20 years ago, I used to know what the difference was between poetry and fiction, and fortunately I've slowly forgotten. And what I really don't read that way anymore, if you know what I mean. I think a lot of, when I went to graduate school, you had to choose poetry or fiction, and then you were channeled into this category. You're a poet, you're a fiction writer, right? And I'm like, I don't know what that means. My favorite fiction writer, alleged fiction writers, are just gorgeous guy. Davenport is a perfect example, right? Every one of his sentences is this little beautiful, lyrical, concentrated poem. But then when you read, poets, it's like they're doing all sorts of amazing things that have often have a narrative, a loose narrative quality to them. And I love loose narrative quality more than firm narrative quality, right? So what's his name? The guy who writes all those novels that make millions of dollars, Brown, something. Yeah, that guy. Oh, come on, we all know who he is. No? Dan Brown. That's right. I could use a good editor. But anyway, no. So my favorite, closest friends like Dan Brown. But like he doesn't care about language. That's a like objective fact. And that's fine. But that's not stuff that attracts me in deep ways. So there's this guy, this psychologist and neuroscientist up at Harvard whose name is what, Pinker, I think it is, who talks about fiction as empathy technology. That's what I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in using fiction as a way to understand something that isn't me in an intimate way. And it just seems so beautiful when you're reading it or when you're writing it, trying to get into another way of being in the world. And that's what I was doing, right? Whether it's a dog's consciousness, which you can't do, or the Hampel's consciousness, or Kentakovic. It's like, I just want to know people that aren't me. And I think a lot of people, when you first start out in fiction, think it's all about me. And it's like, oh no, that's one of your first lessons. It's never about you. It's always about other people. Yeah. And then there was one up here.
I have a quick question, maybe it's not a quick question. A question about photography and its relationship to your practice. I know that's a project that you could share. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about photography, its relationship to writing for you.
Yeah, and I've been really interested, probably, again, like 20 years or so, in the relationship of text to image, right? And text to image works at least two different ways. It works lots of different ways, but oftentimes image is used to illustrate text, right? Or text is used to sort of describe image in a work, which is fine. But what really drew me into the relationship was trying to understand when text and image are like just skewed a little bit, and something else happens in the space between those two things. So as I said briefly up front, notions of dissonance can happen, weird harmonies that you don't see. So when you were looking at those images, those images are from the future of the present of the text, right? They're actually mostly from after World War II, whereas the text is set in 1927. And there is a kind of strange, I hope anxious, forbidding quality to those images, because they create a kind of irony that washes back over what's going on in the text in ways that create this kind of cognitive dissonance, at least for me. And that really draws me in. So in other words, how can you deploy these things in ways that enrich the text rather than simply text and image going together in some way, shape, or form is really interesting to me. Yeah.
I think kind of in that same vein, I'm wondering, I was really interested in what you said in the beginning about how this piece is a translation of a visual work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like other translations you've done that are like translations of a visual work, like frastic work, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So back when I first started to write, I very much wrote out of the reasons that other people write, notions of if you're a fiction writer, a lot of times a story will start in character, it'll start in conflict, or it'll start in a powerful image, or it'll start in a powerful line. And then there came this point where, and I don't know why, but I often have the structure arrive first, as I say, and then something else start cohering around the structure. So, another example is I wrote a novel called Theories of Forgetting a couple of years ago that was based on Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty. Some of you may know this thing, right? All of us in Utah know it very well. It's this magnificent earthwork that's in the north end of the Great Salt Lake, and it forms this, I don't know why, but just incredibly moving, powerful, mythic kind of shape, and it changes the landscape around it, and the landscape changes it, and you can't see the spiral jetty twice the same way because the light's always changing, the weather changes each time you go out, the Great Salt Lake recedes and comes forward and all this. And I was out there once, actually with some grad students, we were studying the idea of the labyrinth. And I thought, oh, what better way to learn about the labyrinth than to go out and try to walk one. So we went out there and we were talking about that, and they were wrapped. They were just like utterly wrapped in the shape and the landscape and everything. And I couldn't get that out of my head. And I just asked myself, like, so what would a novel look like, right, that was based on that form? And it turns out I built a novel. Oh, that's something else I should say. I built a novel. I'm really interested in building text, not just writing them nowadays, and having the page be this sort of space of performance, right? That it's not just what sort of falling through the language into a story, but actually having the page be part of the story, okay? So what I did was to build this novel where there are two narratives, one that goes across the top of the page from beginning to end, and then when you get to the end of that narrative, you flip it over, and the other one moves the other way, right? So it becomes a kind of spiral that you're always turning, and I started playing around with that. I won't go into very much detail, but that's the kind of thing that sparks my imagination these days. Like, how does form happen in one art that carries over to another art and can completely reteach you to see that art, right? That's what we never want to wake up, right, as poets or as fiction writers, whatever these things are, or as any other kind of writer, and not be like incredibly excited to write. And how do you do that, right? How do you create that spark that keeps going? And it's formed for me for a while. Nobody has any World War II questions. Oh, yeah.
A lot of questions kind of about the writing process.
Yeah.
How did you decide what order to put the narratives in, and how would it change if it were in a different order?
So I really relied on the painting in the most general way. So Freundlich saw his painting, as I said, from the bottom up. So his painting for him was utopian, and it moved from this hellish sort of black up into the red of heaven. And I told the story backward, given the 1920s. And so I started with underpainting as the first series of chapters, and then moved down through the painting into the Nazi regime. And so the last page of the pages of the novel, the language itself sort of collapses and becomes this black that echoes Freundlich's shapes. But then how I divvied up each of the chapters was, how many people have read Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway? After you read Ulysses tonight, just pick that one up. It's really wonderful. But so there's this very cool technique she uses where there's this plane that's flying over London, and different people triangulate off of the plane. So like character X will see the plane, and then you go down to character Y who has also just seen the plane, but is a different consciousness, so she's moving between consciousnesses. And what I wanted to do to kind of wave at Virginia Woolf was, at the end of each chapter, to pivot on some kind of important image that would take us organically from one character's mind into another character's mind, switching perspective, or seeing there's literally a plane. In this case, it's the one that Hitler's landing in for a rally that day. And other things. And one grew organically into the next, where I was always trying to tie from one chapter into another. So again, this architectonics that Lydia was talking about, this idea of really trying to think of fiction as a kind of architecture in which each part is connected to the next one, really interested me. Yeah. We should probably wrap up, yeah? Okay, thank you so much for coming. This was awesome. You guys